Chapters 29 through 32 of An American Robinson Crusoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. An American Robinson Crusoe by Samuel B. Allison. Chapter 29. Robinson becomes a farmer. Robinson had now been on the island long enough to know how the seasons changed. He found that there were two kinds of weather there, wet weather and dry weather. There were 2 wet seasons in each year and 2 dry ones. During the wet seasons, which lasted nearly 3 months, Robinson had to remain pretty closely at home, and could not gather grain, for the plants were then starting from the seeds. It ripened in the dry seasons. Robinson soon found that he must have a store of corn and wild rice for food during the rainy seasons. He, however, knew nothing about planting and harvesting, nor preparing the ground for seed. He had it all to learn with no teacher or books to instruct him. He found a little space near his dwelling free from trees and thought he would plant some corn seed here. He did not know the proper time for planting. He thought because it was warm, seeds would grow at any time. It happened his first seed was put in at the beginning of the dry season. He watched and waited to rejoice his eyes with the bright green of a sprouting corn, but the seed did not grow. There was no rain, and the sun's heat parched the land till it was dry and hard on the upland where his corn was planted. "Very well," thought Robinson, "I will plant it at the beginning of the wet season, either in March or September." He did so. The seed quickly sprouted up, but the weeds, shrubs, and vines sprouted as quickly, and before Robinson was aware, his corn was overgrown and choked out by a rank growth of weeds and vines. "I see," said Robinson, "that I must thoroughly prepare the soil before planting my seed." But he had no spade and no other tool that would stand the strain of digging among tough matted roots. But he must succeed. He put a new handle in the stone hoe, or pick, he had already made. His mussel shell spade was worn out. He must set himself to fashion out another. He decided to make one from the tough, heavy wood of a tree that grew plentifully in the forest. He was lucky enough to find a tree of this kind, whose bole had been split lengthwise by the falling of an old rotten tree near it. With his stone tools and the help of fire, he managed after several days' work to make a wide, sharpened tool out of one of the large pieces split off. It was a little over 3 feet long. He had trimmed one end small and cut notches in the sides about 1 foot from the flat end. He could place his foot in the notch and thrust his wooden spade into the earth. With his rude tool he dug up and turned the soil of a small space of ground several times to kill the vines and weeds. His corn quickly sprouted after this attempt and outstripped the weeds and vines which Robinson constantly had to hold in check by pulling and hoeing. He was rejoiced at his growing crop, and went each morning to feast his eyes on the rapidly expanding leaves and ears. One morning, as he came in sight of the little clearing, he thought he saw something disappearing in the low brush on the other side as he approached. Alas! His labor had been in vain. A herd of wild goats had found out the place and had utterly destroyed his crop. Robinson sat down near by and surveyed the ruin of his little field. "It is plain," thought he, "I will have to fence in the field or I will never be able to harvest my crop. I cannot watch it all the time." He had already learned from his experience in making the fence around the goat pasture that the branches of many kinds of shrubs and trees, when broken off and thrust into the ground, will send out roots and leaves, and at length, if planted close together in a line, will form a thick hedge which no kind of beast can get through or over. He found out some willow trees whose branches broke easily, and soon had enough to thrust into the ground about 6 inches apart around the entire edge of his little field, which contained about 1/8 of an acre. After this hedge had grown so as to be a fair protection to his crop, he tried planting again at the proper season. He spaded up the ground and pulled out the matted roots as best he could, and with great pains and care planted his corn in straight, even rows. To make them straight, and each hill of corn the same distance from its neighbors, he first marked off the ground in squares, whose sides were about 3½ feet long. "Now," thought he, "I will reap the reward of my labor." The corn grew rapidly, and toward the end of the first dry season was filling out and ripening its ears. But to Robinson's dismay a new danger threatened his crop against which he could not fence. He was in despair. The birds were fast eating and destroying his partially ripened corn. He could not husk it yet. It was not ripe enough. He thought how easy it would be to protect his field if he had a gun. But he had learned that it is useless to give time to idle dreaming. He must do something, and that quick. "If I could catch some of these rascals," he thought, "I would hang them up on poles, dead, as a warning to the rest." It seemed almost a hopeless task, but he went about it. It was in vain. He tried to kill some of them by throwing rocks and sticks. He could not get near enough to them. At length he laid snares and succeeded in snaring 3 birds. He had learned to weave a pliable, strong thong out of cocoa and other fibre that he was now acquainted with. The birds thus caught he fastened on broken branches of trees, which he stuck into the earth in different parts of his field. The birds heeded the warning and visited his cornfield no more that season. At the end of the season he gathered or husked his corn, and after it was thoroughly dry he shelled it from the cob with his hands. He used his baskets in which to carry his husked ears from the field to his cave, and in which to store it when shelled. He found that the ears were larger and better filled and plumper than when the plants grew wild. He selected the largest and best filled ears for his seed the next time. In this way his new crop of corn was always better in kind and yielded more than the old one. At first he grew 2 crops a year, but by experimenting he found out about how much he needed for his own use and planted once a year enough to give him a liberal supply. He observed that the wild rice grew in swampy lands, so that he did not make the mistake of trying to raise it upon the upland where the corn grew best. He saw at once that the planting of rice on low, marshy, or wet land was beyond his present strength and tools. "Sometime in the future," he thought, "I may try it." Robinson also found wild grapes in abundance. These he dried by hanging them on the branches of trees. He thus had a store of raisins for each rainy season. Chapter 29. Robinson becomes a farmer. Chapter 30. Robinson as potter. Robinson was now anxious to cook his food, to boil his rice and vegetables and bake bread, but he could do nothing without cooking vessels. He had tried to use cocoanut shells, but these were too small and there was no way to keep them from falling over and spilling the contents. He determined to try to make some clay vessels. He knew where he could get a kind of clay that had the appearance of making good ware. It was fine grained and without lumps or pebbles. He was much perplexed to mold the clay into the right shapes. He tried taking a lump and shaping it into a vessel with his hands. He tried many times, but each time the clay broke, and he was forced to try some other way. He recalled how he had made his basket out of strands of twisted grass, and wondered whether he could not make his pots in the same way. He spun the clay out into a long rope and began to coil it around a small basket, forming the layers together with his hands. This was easy, but he did not see clearly how he was going to get the basket out from the inside of the pot. He found he could copy in this way any form he wished, but he finally hit upon the plan of making a form of wicker work and coiling the clay rope inside it. For he saw that whether he succeeded or not in getting the clay free from the basket, he could use the pot, and besides, if the pot would stand the fire the basket would burn off. To dry the pots, Robinson